and to save many, many thousands of lives, and save more lives, and save lives.
How many times have you heard Boris Johnson saying over the past 9 months or so that he wants to save lives? A few days ago, someone sent me a link to a site, boris-johnson.com, that I was so shocked at, I was at first convinced that it must be a fake. However, this site contains so much content over so many years. You can see it goes from March 2016 all the way back to January 2004, filled with content over many years, also with numerous comments on all of the blog posts from members of the public. If this is a fake, this is an extremely elaborate fake. So let me read you the article that I was sent, written by Boris Johnson, dated 25th of October 2007. Global population control. Global overpopulation is the real issue. It is a tragic measure of how far the world has changed and the infinite capacity of modern man for taking offence, that there are no two subjects that can get you more swiftly into political trouble than motherhood and apple pie. The last time I tentatively suggested that there was something to be said in favour of apple pie, I caused a frenzy of hatred in the healthy eating lobby. It reached such a pitch that journalists were actually pelting me with pies and demanding a retraction and an apology and a formal denunciation of the role of apple pie in causing obesity. As for motherhood, the fertility of the human race, we are getting to the point where you simply can't discuss it, and we are thereby refusing to say anything sensible about the biggest single challenge facing the earth. And no, whatever it may now be conventional to say, that single biggest challenge is not global warming. That is a secondary challenge. The primary challenge facing our species is the reproduction of our species itself. Depending on how fast you read, the population of the planet is growing with every word that skitters beneath your eyeball. There are more than 211,000 people being added every day, and a population the size of Germany every year. As someone who has now been travelling around the world for decades, I see this change and I feel it. You can smell it in the traffic jams of the Middle East. You can see it as you fly over Africa at night and you see mile after mile of fires burning red in the dark as the scrub is removed to make way for human beings. Just going on, skipping over some of this content. You can see it as you fly over Mexico City, a vast checkerboard of smog-bound, low-rise dwellings stretching from one horizon to the other. And when you look down on what we are doing to the planet, you have a horrifying vision of habitations multiplying and replicating like bacilli in a petri dish. The world's population is now 6.7 billion, roughly double what it was when I was born. If I live to be in my mid-80s, then it will have trebled in my lifetime. The UN last year revised its forecasts upwards, predicting that there will be 9.2 billion people by 2050, and I simply cannot understand why no one discusses this impending calamity, and why no world statesmen have the guts to treat the issue with the seriousness it deserves. How the hell can we witter on about tackling global warming and reducing consumption when we are continuing to add so relentlessly to the number of consumers? The answer is politics and political cowardice. There was a time in the 1960s and 1970s when people such as my father, Stanley, were becoming interested in demography, and the UN would hold giant conferences on the subject, and it was perfectly respectable to talk about saving the planet by reducing the growth in the number of human beings. But over the years, the argument changed, and certain words became taboo, and certain concepts became forbidden, and we have reached the stage where the very discussion of overall human fertility, global motherhood, has become more or less banned. And then it just goes on to say at the end, it is time we had a grown-up discussion about the optimum quantity of human beings in this country and on this planet. Do we want the southeast of Britain, already the most densely populated major country in Europe, to resemble a giant suburbia? This is not, repeat not, an argument about immigration per se, since in a sense it does not matter where people come from, and with their skill and their industry, immigrants add hugely to the economy. This is a straightforward question of population and the eventual size of the human race. All the evidence shows that we can help reduce population growth and world poverty by promoting literacy and female emancipation and access to birth control. Isn't it time politicians stopped being so timid and started talking about the real number one issue? And there's quite a few interesting comments on that post, not least, will Boris begin the cull with his own children? And if you look at Wikipedia, Boris has 6 children by various different mothers. So he mentions in this post about his father, Stanley Johnson. So let's just take a look at an interview with Stanley Johnson where he puts forward his views on population control within the UK.
But I'd add as a corollary to that, you have to get population under control as well, because if you look at it in sheer economic terms, how can you sustain increases in per capita income at a time when you have rising population without rising economic growth? Whereas if you have a declining population, which is what I would aim for, then of course even a stable economic growth situation will give you increases in per capita income. So that's where I stand on that.
Do you have a sense of what the carrying capacity of Britain is, or of the world as a whole? Or?
Well, Britain, I'd put it at 10 or 15 million. I think that'd be absolutely fine. I mean, that would do us really splendidly. At a limit, 2025, I think it's complete nonsense that we are now confronted with an island, would you believe it, of 70 million people. I wrote a paper, I think it's the only paper the Conservative Party has ever published, and it was published as an old Queen Street paper in June 1972, oddly enough, and it was called Britain Needs a Population Policy. And
you could still argue that today, I mean, right now?
I certainly could, but what has happened, of course, is that we have all been, as it were, shunted off course by what you might call the rise of political correctness, because you can't talk about this now without being saying you're anti-feminist, because you're telling women what to do with their bodies, or you're racist, because you're saying it's the browns and the blacks and the yellow races who mustn't have, or you're a left-winger, because you're trying to get at the capitalist society. So it's a very, very difficult one now, and I would say that at the very least, the governments of the world have to start talking, the government of this country has to start talking seriously about immigration. Because if you look at the rise in Britain's population now, you will see that, as it were, there is a really serious differential in the fertility of the immigrant population to the fertility of what you might call the indigenous population. So anyway, but this is very political stuff, not one for Guardian readers.
10 to 15 million. 20 to 25 million at a maximum. So given that the UK population is currently 67 million, that's 50 million people who are excess to requirements. Who do you think the first people that would be culled amongst that excess 50 million would be? Now do you understand why millions of elderly and vulnerable are being herded into experimental genetic engineering injections which have been not fully tested, and where we are not being given any statistics on adverse health impact events and deaths as a result. We need to be very careful about what is going on.
And to save many, many thousands of lives. And save more lives. And save lives.